Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Absolutely delighted to have the expertise of Sarah Donarski, recently completed her MSc in Learning and Teaching at the University of Oxford and has edited a brilliant book on assessment. So do look that up and read that as well. We'll put the link out in the link to this video. But really happy to be speaking to Sarah today. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your time.
Yeah, no worries at all. Yeah, lovely to speak to you. So always a pleasure.
Thanks, Sarah. Let's dive straight in with our first question. So Sarah, what do you believe the purpose of assessment is?
It's the big hitter, yeah. Ultimately, the purpose of assessment, I mean, if we're going to sum it up, I think completely, is to allow a teacher to recognize or see the bridge between the material that we're teaching in the classroom and then the way that it's being processed or manipulated by our students on a more individual level. I think it's really important to recognize that assessment does not just mean an assessment at the end of a term. And in fact, people hopefully will know that assessment happens on a class-to-class basis, on a minute-by-minute basis, and exists in so many different ranges and forms. So we will talk about, I think, assessment as being that sort of finite thing at the end of a course, but when we're understanding exactly how our students are manipulating that information and processing that information, that happens every single lesson through questioning as well, through conversations, through little worksheets, through homework tasks. So we have those two different forms of assessment, which I think is quite important to recognize immediately as we talk about this idea.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Sarah. And that leads us really nicely onto our next question. You've studied assessment a lot, so I was wondering if you had like top 5 tips for busy teachers on creating assessments that really are effective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I'll definitely go to those. I think, again, when we're looking at introducing these tips, I think understanding that what we're trying to do is get our students from the process of knowledge into understanding. And one of the best ways that I articulate this whenever I talk about it is knowledge is something that you repeat, something you're able to say, this is a fact, whatever. Understanding is when that knowledge is required in a spontaneous situation. So, for example, teaching a child to say thank you, they will know to repeat it if you give them a sweet and you go thank you and then say thank you. But that doesn't mean they understand the concept of thank you until they can say open a door, or somebody opens a door for them and they go thank you, because that is a different spontaneous situation. So as you're sort of moving towards developing really effective assessment in the classroom, I think understanding that actually you're moving in a process with your students from being able to assess in the first instance knowledge, because without knowledge there will be no understanding.
Yes.
And then as you know that knowledge is secured, moving into the assessment of understanding, as in giving various different equations in science or maths that students wouldn't have recognized but would require the knowledge that you feel they have secured. And also, say in English, applying various essays or essay topics that they haven't studied, but they've got the knowledge of the play. So the top 5 tips, and I'll probably have to explain these a little bit with a visual.
Please do.
So the first one would be, within modules, form assessment around the skills that you want to develop. So I'm going to share my screen because I feel like I can explain this a little bit better with a visual. This is a visual I put together for the Chartered College of Teaching, whereby I did a training course for them on assessment. And it is an English example, so hopefully people can apply it to their subject. But essentially, when I go into a module, so for example, the one I've given is Macbeth, I think about what is my end objective. And my end objective in the case of Macbeth is over here on the right, is that students will be able to write an essay on any theme presented in Macbeth, including using quotations and contextual analysis. That's my end goal. But in order to get there, my students need a range of skills. I've put it in a step by step in order to get to that thing. So the first skill they would need is that a student has a confident knowledge in Macbeth, which you can see on the other side. If I don't assess that, I can't really move on to the next bit, because I need to know that my students are there in order to then say use quotations and then form an essay in general. So hopefully that makes sense. In the first thing for assessment is know where you're going with your modules and know what skills to assess along the way. Does that make sense?
Right? Yeah, love it.
The next thing, therefore, would be to know then what that looks like in the bigger picture of your schemes. Yeah. So Claire Hill, who writes a chapter of my book, talks about this as being a sort of spiral curriculum. So if I know by year 10 or year 11 that my students need to know particular skills, I might low level start assessing them on those skills in year 7, 8, and 9. Just so I can build them. Now, those skills won't obviously be exactly the same. They will be steps towards that skill, but that will give you a really clear indication that your students, that your assessment is, important, that your assessment is valuable, and that your data gives you a nice alignment with exactly where that student is going and how that student is progressing towards the skills they need later on.
Yes.
Right. The third thing then, the third thing is to assess little and often.
Nice.
Yeah, and I think what's really important about that is that does not mean marking a lot. So one of the biggest things that people think is that, okay, if I'm assessing my students all the time, then I'm taking home lots of marking, but actually you can do that in various different ways. So if, for example, I wanted to assess the skill of knowledge in Macbeth, I can do that with a multiple choice questionnaire. I can do that with a verbal conversation. And a multiple choice test can be marked by students, and a verbal conversation can be a general assessment that I'm making, and that doesn't need to be a bunch of marking. So in the same way, sorry, I'm going to share my screen again. In the same way that we have those little steps, you can look at it as what is the most effective assessment type here. And so, for example, if I want to know that a student has confident knowledge in Macbeth, then I could use multiple choice questions, quizzes, and short answer responses. And I can also then use whole class feedback. I could have an answer sheet. I could use peer assessment, and I could use student self-assessment as well using an answer sheet. So that means there is no marking there for me, but I can record immediately or see immediately where my students' schemas are not being fulfilled, and I can go back and teach that knowledge, or I can move on with the next skill.
Brilliant.
And yeah, and that happens on a day by day. So that's not just big assessments, it's little and often, and little and often will give you the best understanding of where your students are at.
And I think the teachers out there listening will be so grateful to hear that you don't have to take home piles and piles of marking. There are effective ways of marking and assessing and feeding back that don't actually involve the teacher and their red pen. Hopefully not using red pen anyway, but yeah, I think that's really, really helpful for time-starved teachers. Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely. So that the third, assess little often, the fourth then goes with that, feedback little and often.
Yes.
Okay, to make sure that you're putting in processes where you can say that's right or wrong, but that fundamentally there is still more work happening from the child than the teacher. And I think that's a really important thing that we always need to remember, like, actually, am I doing more work here than the child when I'm marking? And if the answer is yes, stop. Yeah, and then the fifth thing then about assessment is to stress to students that this is not about judging them. This is not about ego. Okay, so it's not about them knowing that they got 18 and their friend got 16 and they beat their friend. This is not about ego. The point of assessment is about seeing how students can get better and seeing where students need to improve. So yeah, so you can do that in various ways. You can ensure that you remove grades, so you're only giving feedback responses. Ruth Butler, obviously, in her so obviously for trainee staff, so Ruth Butler did her 1988 work on using grades and how they all have a detrimental effect on a student's progress, because the task then becomes ego involved as opposed to task involved. So yeah, so stress to students, this is just about changing learning behavior, and this is about recognizing where I need to go back and teach, or you've clearly misunderstood something, or you've manipulated this in the incorrect way, and we need to rectify that. We need to push that back into boundary.
Brilliant. And what advice would you give teachers? Because I know that I often try and not give grades and I get pushback from the students. What advice would you give me?
I think usually you will get pushback from top end students. So most research suggests that in particular sort of middling students, or students who aren't necessarily achieving as strong academically as they want to, you won't get pushback from them. That was quite it's the students who originally go in with it being an ego thing anyway. So I mean, previously being at Wellington, when I had those students and they were about, well, miss, but what was my grade? I would be like, this isn't about your ego, look at my feedback. And I would be very curt and honest with them about that. For other students, I think if it's a whole school policy, it obviously helps if you do for a class regularly that you're not giving a grade. And then you put in a lesson where you're like, no, this wasn't about grading. What this was about was figuring out how to get better. So that's what our next lesson is going to be like. That will work a little bit more for a few more challenging sets. But predominantly, you'll find a link between ego-involved students in the first instance having the pushback. So
that's so helpful. Thank you so much.
That's okay.
So, are there any mistakes that you often see teachers making around assessments that you'd like to give some advice on?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like so just to give some context, so I've just taken over as head of a department. What I have done already in the first instance is every time we start a new term, I look at all the assessments that were previously written. I've been looking over it and just checking that this is exactly aligned with what we're trying to teach our students, the skills we want our students to have coming out, and if it's not, how can we make this better? So I think realistically, one of the biggest mistakes, and I've definitely seen this in various instances before, is that we create assessment without any real good discussion or reflection of exactly what we're doing when we do that.
Yes.
So I think if in the first instance there's no real proper alignment with the skills that students need to learn, assessment will be very poor, and that's particular for sort of end of module assessments as well. The second thing we've touched upon as well, which is that feedback for students, there's either not enough time given to it, or like we said, it's sort of a burden on teachers rather than the burden on students. And I think that distinction is really important to make, because if we do that badly, it will take away from the power and importance of giving feedback in the instance as well. Another thing is the idea of poor proxies for learning. So I'm not sure if you've done much on this, Katy, before, but the fact that we do have this idea sometimes that we can look at a student and assess, we assess them immediately and we think they have got it. Or we'll ask our students a question and the smartest kid will put their hand up and say something quite surfaced and it's agreeable. So we think, yes, they've got it.
Yes.
So we make these poor judgments on the students' learning from these poor proxies.
Yes.
So I think as well, just making sure that actually that assessment is strong enough so you are getting a more accurate view of that student's understanding of the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have you seen any? Because I've got a couple more, but I don't want to overwhelm.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, I mean, poor proxies for learning are they're very compelling, and it's so lovely as a teacher. And so even if one person or two people in the class answer and they actually give you a really good answer, you can sometimes think, amazing, the whole class has got it. And yeah, because if you see them, the rest of the class like nodding and smiling and like, yeah, you can kind of assume that everybody's got it. So yeah, I would say it's problem. I think a massive problem I see is teachers spending hours and hours doing all this beautifully detailed feedback, and they're showing so much care and love for their students, and I love that and I really celebrate that. And at the same time, I then see the students just looking at the grades. So I think your point about grades is huge, because all this work that the teacher's done is completely wasted, because exactly as you say, it's got to be more work for the students, because otherwise where's the learning? The teachers learned a lot, and that's great because the teacher has a really good idea of how to adjust their teaching to make it more effective in teaching what they want to teach, but actually the amount the students learn from that is pretty minimal. So I think those would be my two big mistakes that I see in myself and others as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's two extra things, little bits of gold that I think you've touched upon, which I'll definitely say just because this is for training, and I think it's really important. Yeah, like with the sort of, particularly for English, the overwriting on an essay, it's so much more beneficial for students if you see a student really falling down in their assessment on every single skill, just start with one or two.
Yes.
Because it's too much to say that sentence is muddled, this doesn't make sense, you haven't included that. It's overloading. So just to be like, you know what, we're going to start from the beginning, we'll look at introductions, and we're just going to start there, and we're going to have a lesson where we look at 6 or 7 introductions, and then you're going to rewrite yours. Okay, now we'll go on to our first point. Right, let's just focus on including context or including quotations. And I think just compartmentalizing that really helps a student understand what you're giving back when you do give back feedback to their assessment, because I guess assessment is always that process. So when you're feeding back, it's never a final, it shouldn't be a final feedback. And that is the sort of annotated essay to the death is like a final feedback thing. But if you just say, you know what, I'm fully aware this is a process as well, so actually for you we're just going to focus on quotations, that's going to be our next step, and then we'll move on to the next one, and then the next one. I think that can be really helpful for students.
Oh, so helpful, both for the student and for the teacher, because then you've got clarity. Because if you're overwriting something and you're picking up 8 things, what do you do in class? What do you do with that student? Whereas if you're just saying, right, quotations it is, you and the student can really collaboratively tackle that together, and that's really exciting. And it just makes so much sense in terms of motivation, engagement, not absolutely crushing their morale and thinking, and I guess it's quite a lot to do with their self-efficacy as well, because they're like, yes, I can tackle quotations, I can tackle an introduction at one time, I can't do everything, but I believe that, yeah, I've got it in me to make my quotations more effective. So I think it's really positive from that point of view too.
Yeah, no, definitely. I had a student at Wellington actually who really struggled with including context, and my feedback was always from his assessment, you need to put in more context, you need to put in more context. But that in itself as feedback is quite poor, isn't it, if he doesn't understand what that is and what that looks like? Because for him, what he was doing was including more context, a sentence or two across his essay, but not enough. So what I did was I got an essay of a really brilliant context, and we just looked at context. So even though there was a lot of other work that could have been done on that essay, all I did was highlight the context in his work and highlighted the context in another piece of work.
Yes.
So he could see the difference. And that's where we started with that. It was just focusing on that, and then we'll deal with the other bits later. But doing it skill by skill, I think is the step to that final bit.
And that specificity is so important as well, because I often get it, and I make this mistake, I'm really ashamed to say, but in geography it's all about place specific detail, and I'll be writing place specific detail on all these essays, and if I don't actually take the time to exemplify that and show exactly what I mean by place specific detail and how you use that in an essay effectively, then I'm really wasting my time, and I'm certainly wasting my poor students' time. So I love that you brought that up. I think that's such a helpful example and a real time saver as well.
Yeah, no, yeah, and I think just quickly, like two more things that I think mistakes that we make. I think the first one is probably when we overconflate ability from a result. So I think it's really important always that to recognize as teachers that learning is a process. And Dylan William writes about this, I think, very succinctly in the opening of the book that I did, where he talks about spellings, and he says actually every spelling test is still a random number, you know, because every spelling test will have different words. So you can't actually conflate a student's ability to spell necessarily, because the words that they have one day could be better for them than words they have another day. And all you can do to get the most accurate understanding of their ability data and understanding is give them, like, keep doing it, and that's going to really help you build up. And I see that in English all the time. You know, you get a student do really well on a guilt essay in Macbeth, but then really poorly on a power one, because so we can't accurately say because they got a level 9 in their guilt essay they're going to get a level 9 in Macbeth, because there are still those things we need to work on to get a more accurate picture of exactly where that student is at and exactly how confident their understanding of the play is. So
yeah, which loops beautifully back to your model with the steps, and being really careful about your design, assessment, and the idea of little and often, and making sure that you are assessing what you want to be assessing right the way through as often as possible. That's brilliant. Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Fantastic. So I guess we probably need to wrap up now, which is really sad, because I would love to speak to you for hours and hours more. But yeah, trying to be mindful of time. It's Friday night, and I'm so grateful that Sarah's given up her Friday evenings to speak to me. Sarah, what one thought on assessment would you like to leave teachers with?
I'm stealing this, I'm not going to lie. But I think if I was to sum up learning and assessment, I'm going to take it from Robin McPherson, Dylan William, Carl Hendrick. And it's behind the philosophy that assessment is the process of understanding our pupils and helping them learn and change and progress. So therefore, as I said, to quote and steal them, you know, this is actually about changing the learner and not just the work. Okay, we want to see them develop better habits. We want to see them recognize mistakes they're making. We want to see them improve their knowledge. So we do want to see them change through the process of assessment, not just change a piece of work, but change a habit. Yeah. So improving the learner and not the work.
Love it. Improve the learner and not the work. Sarah, that has been the greatest joy. Thank you so much for your time, and look forward to catching up again soon. Thank you very much.
Bye.